Hey there, Underground Sessions podcast listeners. We're so glad you're back. It's been an exciting season. Today, we have a fast-paced episode. We're going to be talking about all issues as it relates to legal stuff that's going on, Supreme Court, and we're also going to take a look at the major themes that Christians should care about as it relates to election issues, I think. So we're going to be looking at those. I'm joined by Jesse Nash. He has been a wonderful conversation partner. He's a lawyer. He cares deeply about these issues, and I think you'll find him very insightful today. So stick around. You won't want to miss this. All right. Well, Jesse, it's great to have you here, man. It's been a while. Good to see you.
It has, Bob. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah. I always love having these conversations with you, so I'm glad that you made the time for us. I also like those glasses, too. I'm going to have to go update my frames or something.
Yeah, your hair and makeup people are on point, very professional.
Very much. Yeah, no, maybe Tim later on we can talk about credits for people that are doing our hair and makeup afterwards.
That's right.
Well, anyway, Jesse is our resident legal expert, so anytime I have a legal question, I usually will start with him and say, what do we do about this? And then he'll talk about how he's really focused on a specific area of the law, and he'll get me over the people that I need to know about. But you are a wonderful resource.
I can deflect legal questions with the best of them.
Oh, that makes you a good lawyer, I guess. Well, so today we're gonna be talking a little bit about the legal aspects of things that are going on in the culture. And I thought we'd start with maybe you can just tell us a little bit about the broader trends you're seeing in the legal landscape, specifically as it relates to First Amendment issues. I know there's a lot of things that are going on. So why don't you give us a flyover of what's going on in the legal news?
Yeah, sure. So, as not part of my professional scope, but as part of my religious interest and as a hobby, I kind of track what the latest legal developments are in the religious field. So there's basically two types of religious kind of lines of cases. There's the anti-establishment line of cases, which is, the government cannot establish an official religion, right? Or respect an establishment of religion in the nomenclature of the First Amendment. And the free exercise clause, which is the government cannot prohibit the free exercise of religion. So those are kind of the two main
So
threads.
They can't tell me they can't establish a religion, and they also can't restrict how I practice my religion. Is that fair?
Right. That's right. And context is key here, right? So when the Constitution was passed, just following the Revolutionary War, during the Enlightenment phase, right, it was a reaction to a lot of the religious wars that were going on in Europe, where they would literally, Bob, you can look it up, they would have whole wars based over what prayer book they were going to use. I swear to you, there was a whole war fought over it.
Well, there was whole wars fought over how you would baptize people back in Europe in the ancient days.
That's right. And by the way, Baptists did not do well back then, right? They persecuted the Baptists too. So we have quite the history there. So anyway, so when the settlers came over to the U.S., they really wanted to go a different direction in terms of the way the government interacted with religion. And this trickled through Enlightenment philosophy, and it certainly showed up in the minds of the Founding Fathers, and of course got codified in the First Amendment to the Constitution, right? So the context is key there. So the way things went forward, really there wasn't much going on in the 1700s and the 1800s. In the early 1900s, the Supreme Court of the United States started to interact seriously with some of these cases, and effectively what they came out with was a test based upon with respect to the anti-establishment, right? If you touched and concerned religion, it was going to get viewed if a governmental action was touching and concerning religion and was seeming to promote one set of religious ideas over another, or religious worldviews over non-religious worldviews, is going to be looked at with disfavor. And on the free exercise side of the equation, if as long as the law was of general application, and as an incidental matter, it seemed to impact people with religious beliefs, it was going to be effectively the courts were going to defer to the legislature, right? So it wasn't great for decades there. And so in recent years, the law has kind of changed. So I graduated from law school in 2003, And I remember
It's quite some time ago.
It is.
Traveled some miles since then.
Yes, there was some tread on the tires, or somewhere on the tires since then. That's for sure. So I remember my religious liberty and the First Amendment class, and you could basically take everything that they taught me and throw it out. The law has completely turned over in the past 20 years or so. So effectively what's happened is, and we could talk about some cases specifically, but what's happened is we've moved away from this kind of idea that any endorsement of religion was going to be automatically viewed with disfavor towards more a perspective that we were going to defer to history and tradition. So the current court right now, that seems to be the aperture through which they look at a lot of these anti-establishment cases. So there's this Kennedy versus Bremerton case that came out last year. This is the coach who was engaging in voluntary prayer activities after football games, right? And so
this went to the Supreme Court, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a Supreme Court case that came out, I believe it's 2023. And this, the school prayer was ended in the 60s, and effectively what the government said, okay, so before the 1960s, I believe it was 1962, before this point, in most public schools in the United States of America, there was mandatory prayer, right? The teacher would sit the kids down and make them have a prayer time, and they all would say a prayer together before they started lessons, right? So the courts struck that down and banned that practice because they viewed it as coercive to the kids. Mm-hmm. It was literally the teacher as an agent of the government making a kid pray, right? So that was not acceptable to the Supreme Court. They struck it down. That alone was the impetus for a lot of the political awakening of the evangelical Christian community in the United States of America. That and abortion were basically the two shots heard around the world that kicked off the moral majority. And Jerry Falwell and a lot of the history around that culminated in the Reagan Revolution and brought us to where we are today, right? So anyway, in this Bremerton case, it's ironically we're back with prayer on school grounds, and in this case it was completely voluntary and it was silent and it was a coach doing it and leading by example, and students would naturally follow along.
Okay. And this became a problem.
Yes. I believe the coach was fired for it, or at least someone brought suit trying to stop it. And effectively, what the court relied on was, this is not coercion. This is not something where a government actor is making kids engage in a religious expression. This is something people are doing because they want to, and in deference to history and tradition, we should allow it to happen. Right, so it really was, I think more. You're the minister on this podcast, Bob, so you can tell me what you think. But it was more, I think, of a just result. Right, I don't know that I want students compelling prayer. I don't know if I want students viewing prayer as something their teachers make them do. Against their own free will, right? I don't know that's how we should engage with our Creator.
Certainly not in public schools, yeah.
Certainly, yeah. But in cases where a leader wants to kind of, by example, invoke God, and engage in prayer as part of his role as a coach, and kids want to join in voluntarily of their own volition, I would argue that's a just result. That's where we should be. And so we're starting to see a lot of cases like this. And obviously these cases have precedential effects. So the next case builds on the one before it.
Right.
And so this trend is really picking up speed, and it's great.
Good. So that's one example. Are there other examples that are out there?
Sure. So
other categories that we should be aware of?
Yeah. So there's cases on clergy-led prayer and legislative-led prayer where suits are brought trying to ban these types of governmental actors engaging in prayer, and this is mostly in the circuit courts, so the system of courts just below the Supreme Court. And it's been kind of a wipeout recently in terms of courts upholding the governmental actor's right to engage in that sort of religious expression. And another another area of cases that's been awesome recently is with respect to funding. So your listeners might remember a couple years ago there was this Trinity Lutheran case. So effectively, what was happening there was there was a governmental program that provided for funding basically it was chewed up rubber bits from recycled tires. You could apply to get this for your playground. And I think a Christian school, I believe it was, if I remember correctly, applied and was denied because, hey, churches, schools, Christian organizations can't get this benefit. Okay. And it was appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the court said, look, if there's going to be a generally applicable governmental benefit, religious organizations can't be excluded from that because that's discriminating against the free exercise of religion.
So the town would not give funding to help the Christian school get chips in their parking lot?
That's right. No chips for you. And and they sued.
Seems like
and
somebody
won.
had an axe to grind there for some reason.
There was that's right. And there's a lot of hostility behind this that, is prevalent in our culture. And I'm sure that you've seen it in your life. I certainly have in mine. But what we're basically seeing is the emergence of a non-discrimination doctrine with respect to a lot of these cases, where the courts are saying, if you have a generally applicable thing, you can't exclude people of faith or organizations of faith from this. And I would argue again, Bob, that's the just result, right? That seems to me to be about where it should be. I don't want churches favored. I don't want one religious organization or one system of police favored over others. And I don't want people excluded from engaging in public life only because of their organization happens to have a religious bent.
Right, which is how the First Amendment should work. So obviously, I think we're in an election season, and the First Amendment continues to come up as being a major issue. Part of that is speech, and some people get confused sometimes as it relates to being able to exercise your religion in public. Sometimes people think freedom of religion really means freedom of worship. As long as you're inside the walls of the church, that's perfectly fine. You can say whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. But as soon as you get out into the public square, at your job, in public spaces, then it's a problem. If you are trying to live out your sincerely held religious beliefs, you're imposing that on other people. So are there issues related to that type of thing that are going on, or how would you suggest people should navigate that, and what should they be aware of?
Yeah, sure. So this is your listeners may have heard of Masterpiece Cake Shop or 303
Probably,
Creative, right?
It was a big one.
So these are cases where in Masterpiece Cake Shop, it was a cake shop. In 303 Creative, I believe it was a web designer. And effectively,
Yes.
They were both creative endeavors where folks with their hands or with their brains were forced to employ their creative minds and skills and gifts to, perform a service for the public. And in both cases, there's some these folks were targeted. Like, make no mistake about it, they were set up to fail here.
Well, in the case of Masterpiece Cake Shop, they have continued to come after. I think he's in another lawsuit.
That's
out
right.
there.
That's right.
Because they keep coming after him for whatever.
I was. It seems like that poor guy's life got overturned or upturned. I think his business is still there and it's doing very well. But he's in interminable litigation. And thank God for the Alliance for Defending Freedom.
Right.
And you had, I think it was Lincoln Wilson is Amy's lawyer. She was here.
Yes. He was on our podcast the other week.
I was just listening on the drive up. By the way, just for the record, I drove from Princeton to Millington to do this, and I figured I'd wait and listen to Amy and her podcast. I do pro bono work for First Choice. Nothing as fun and exciting as what's going on now. But I'm familiar with it in a professional capacity what's going on there, and I'm gonna listen to the podcast. And I'm like, I can't follow that. I gotta do an underground sessions following Amy Pendel. Like, that's like, she's like making she's Millington's favorite daughter. She's making national news, and God bless her. Right, she's really up against it. That organization is really up against it. Thank God for Alliance for Defending Freedom, because I'm telling you right now. But for them and volunteer legal help and such competent, professional, capable legal help, I might add, the legal fees for something like that would be crippling for an organization like that.
Yeah, they do wonderful work, and it was such surprising to me. So we went down to the courthouse that day. We were praying for the case as it was happening. And he came out and he gave us the whole, what happened in the court. Apparently, it was really complicated. So I'm not sure that I would have understood what they were talking about.
A lot of procedural nuances there that are frankly.
But he flew from Idaho just to come here and then flew right back to
Oh wow,
Ohio.
yeah.
So that's where he's located.
That's yeah. Thank God for them. And
Yeah.
I just want to reiterate for the people at home, like what happened there is that the New Jersey Attorney General's office collaborated with Planned Parenthood to put out a public statement putting down religiously backed women's resource centers, not just First Choice, there were others, and then they engaged in this fishing expedition subpoena process. And I got to just underscore, there was as Amy pointed out, there was a op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal about this. Everyone should go look and read that. And there was a couple other cases, or a couple other big articles in national news outlets. And if you go Google it and you go read it, what's going to jump out at you is this: they truly can't understand that folks with religious worldview would want to help women, would truly and honestly help women in crisis pregnancies, that we're just in it to stop those abortions, to take away women's rights. Like, forget about helping people and trying to make people in a tough situation have a little bit easier go of it, providing resources and guidance and health support. And it's all very neatly categorized, what they do and how they do it. There's nothing hidden. But their worldview is so distorted that they default right to a perspective where religious women's resource centers are duping people into, oh, we're a health clinic, come talk to us, as a way to deceive them away from getting an abortion. And that's their sole reason for existence, and that's why they need the New Jersey Attorney General, who's part of the government, to oppress them in this way. It's absolutely egregious, and it should upset us all.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So I want to mention, for Alliance Defending Freedom, we had planned a section of this discussion where we're going to walk through the 5 focuses that they have on their website, which are religious freedom, free speech, sanctity of life, marriage and family, and parental rights.
Sure.
They specifically focus on those areas. So I'd love to talk about those, and we had some practical things that are happening right now. But was there anything else in the legal landscape that you feel like is worth talking about before we jump into that?
So you were talking about the interface between can you only practice your religion in the sanctity of your own home or in your own church, or can you actually take it out? Does your sincerely held religious beliefs have any play or merit in your public involvement? And 303 Creative and Masterpiece Cake Shops say the following, right? That when it comes to creative endeavors, the government cannot compel you to deploy those creative endeavors in a way that violates your sincerely held religious beliefs. That is effectively violating your freedom of conscience, which violates your right to exercise your religion the way that you see fit, and that violates the First Amendment, right? That's where things sit right now. It's a very good case. Now, look, those were particularly egregious edge cases, right? So what that means for someone who may be forced to engage with social issues at his or her job, how exactly that plays out in the employment context, it is yet to be litigated. I was just doing some Googling the other day, and I see that there's a case of Virginia where a Virginia school board fired a teacher because he refused to use a student's pronouns of choice when the student had identified as a gender different from that to which him or her was assigned at birth, and the teacher was fired, and he sued. And it just settled for a big pile of money, right? So
he won.
Yeah, he won. Yeah,
okay.
Sorry, thank you for. Yeah, the teacher won, and you're starting to see some precedents there with that high watermark of, you must do what we say. You must obey despite your sincerely held religious beliefs, and we will hold you to it, and we will fire you if you don't. You're starting to see cases emerge where that's being walked back. Now, exactly where that ends and exactly how that resolves and the specific nuances of kind of what you can and can't do remain to be seen. And honestly, Bob, a lot of us at our workplace are living in kind of a gray area, right? What can you say and what can't you say? What is going to get you fired or sued and what's not?
And that's something that you think about on a regular basis.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was on a call today
that you might not have had to do 20 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I was on a call today where a client called because a transgender person was being terminated, and they wanted to know, hey, look, what do we do here? Just happened today, right?
Yeah.
So it's a emerging issue we all have to deal with. I think that we all need to exercise spiritual discernment and wisdom and tact and grace when we interact with people, even those we disagree with, and we need to be guided by that. That certainly was Christ's example. But at the same time, we don't have to check our religion at the door when we enter our workplace or we enter the public sphere. So I think cases are coming out that are supporting that.
Yeah, that's good. So I think maybe one thing to say about this, and this is where Christians are running into, I think, a lot of tension points. These are things that are fairly new in terms of having to deal with those in the public square. Things that even 10, 15 years ago were just assumed, that do rub up against biblical issues. Now, they might not be the gospel, do you believe that Jesus is Lord? But they are very, from a biblical worldview, are very important issues, such as, did God create us male and female? When does life begin? Things like that. Those are things that are very important issues for Christians, that if you're going to live out your Christian faith, it's gonna bump up against the issues of the moment, and people are seeing that in a way they haven't seen before. Would you say that's fair to say?
That's absolutely fair. I'm specifically sensitive to cases where folks with sincerely held religious beliefs are being affirmatively compelled to act in a way that violates their conscience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. It's one thing to say, hey, look, you can't discriminate on the basis of sexual identity, gender identity, sexual orientation. It's one thing to say that, and it's another thing to say, no, you have to say, you have to word this the way we want you to word it. You have to basically affirmatively acknowledge that our perspective about gender identity is correct. That's when you start to, and look, and there's different perspectives on this. Some might argue that, look, use someone's pronouns is a small, polite accommodation to make, as long as people know where you stand. There's different arguments, different ways, and we're not really here to discuss every nuance. But
yeah, well, I think that the issue, though, is that some of those are conscience issues.
Exactly.
So the question is, should the government, or should your employer compel you and force you to violate your conscience?
And what I always think about, Bob, and I do have a libertarian bent on these things, but what people forget is that the government has the monopoly on violence in our society, right?
Oh, yeah.
They have
Romans
guns.
13, they have the sword.
Yes,
Power of the sword.
They have guns, and they can make us do stuff by pain of punishment, imprisonment, and even death, right? So when a government is the impetus for a requirement, and that requirement violates your religious precepts, like all sorts of spidey senses should be going up about that.
Well, there you go. Well, why don't we jump into these 5 issues I just mentioned, and I will caveat this and say, if you haven't checked out our first episode for this season, Pastor Dave and I did talk about I think we titled it "The Church and the State," and we walked through basically a political theology paper that our elders created over the summer to help guide how we're interacting with political issues. So, one of the things in there is that we don't endorse candidates, but there are specific issues that we are concerned about, that we do think are not just from a Baptist perspective, but also from a scriptural perspective, that are important to talk about and be aware of, and in some cases take a stand on. So I think these issues fall broadly in line with that. So I'll say again: religious freedom, free speech, sanctity of life, marriage and family, and parental rights. So you had prepared to kind of walk us through each of those categories and talk about the hot topic, and then talk a little bit about where the candidates are on those issues.
Sure. Yeah.
So let's start with religious freedom.
Yeah. So look. So some table setting, right, Bob? So first of all, I love what you and Dave had to say. I love that position piece that your elder board came out with. I thought it was completely biblical, completely appropriate, and totally frames our thinking as we enter into this election season, right? We're not here to support a particular candidate or party, but we are here to talk about what a biblical perspective is and how it plays out in the political sphere, right? So with that in mind, yeah, religious freedom, right? That's kind of on the on your board's position paper. That was definitely one of the pieces.
We talked about, obviously, sanctity of human life. We talked about I would categorize them creation order issues. So life, the natural family, and there's a lot of categories that fall underneath that. I think obviously marriage to family, parental rights, sexuality, things like that, and religious freedom. So that's
right.
That's been a historic Baptist thing.
Sure. So religious freedom. So when we're thinking about how to vote, religious freedom should be an issue, right? Because if we do not stand up for the free exercise of religion,
and it has very practical consequences depending on how it plays out.
That's right. Yeah. If people of faith don't stand up for exercise of faith, no one's gonna, right? So if you look at the candidates' record on this, and as I mentioned, there's the hot topics in this front are probably the Comer case, right, and the Masterpiece and the 303 creative cases and some of the stuff we just covered, but that's certainly kind of where the bleeding edge of culture is on this, is those Supreme Court cases, which I mentioned have been largely positive and largely affirming of religious liberties in our country. So where do the candidates stand? Well, we know in the Trump administration, when he took office in 2017, there was several executive orders that were passed that basically prohibited removed regulatory burdens that had been placed on religious organization funding. Right, so we know that there was some commitment in the first Trump administration that specifically wanted to make it easier for religious organizations to get access to federal funding programs. So that was a pretty strong, pretty good affirmation of kind of, religious expression in the public sphere. So that was what I would categorize as a good and appropriate step. I certainly have my issues with Trump. I'm sure everybody does, but that was certainly something you can kind of look to and say, wow, this is an administration that has a commitment to not excluding persons of faith from the public sphere. That's great. Harris, I'll say this. So she has a Hindu mother, and she's married to a person of her husband's Jewish. Yeah.
So, but it might also be worth saying when we're talking about religious liberty, we're not just talking about Christian religious liberty. We're talking about across the board.
And I would also say that Christians should be mindful of the religious liberties of religious minorities, because you know what? Who else is a religious minority nowadays? Christians, right? So it's a lot of times folks in minority religions are the canaries in the coal mine, right? If they're being discriminated against, it's only a matter of time till those legal trends take hold and get applied towards other contexts, some of which are going to impact us. So it's important that we keep an eye on all religious freedom, right? So Harris, right? So her mother's Hindu, her husband's Jewish. So she certainly has made a lot of statements over the years that kind of are empathetic to folks with a religious worldview, to religious minorities, but let's be very clear that she has subordinated that to other considerations and other sort of inclusive, like specifically LGBTQ rights, right? That's mostly where it's come up, and we know that that she's oftentimes made statements where your religious beliefs are not a license to discriminate, and she's when she was in the Senate, she proposed legislation that effectively codified that, and it would largely scale back the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was a federal law passed during the Clinton administration, which basically codified that the free exercise of religion and that the government cannot pass laws, that it kind of expanded the aperture of the protections that affords. She proposed legislation while she was in the Senate. She was only in the Senate for a couple of years, right? She only did so much when she was in there. And one of the things that she did was propose this bill, right? So she's shown some hostility to free exercise of religion, specifically when it impacts, the political hot button social issues of the day. So everybody should just be aware of that and know where each candidate sits on both sides of that issue.
Right, sure. Or at least what their track record says about those issues.
Sure.
Okay. All right, secondly, free speech. This has been a big one out there. In fact, there was a pretty viral clip of, I think it was John Kerry that went around that was talking about free speech being an impediment to accomplishing whatever it was that they were trying to accomplish.
Yeah, those pesky people, and they want to speak about stuff.
This is a big issue that people are arguing about, and it's sort of concerning about how we're not just allowing free speech, and we're limiting it based on what we consider hate speech or misinformation or whatever it is.
Yeah. So what's happened there, and everybody knows this, right? This isn't breaking news. What's happened there is over the past 10 years, we've had proliferation of social media. Everybody's online, and what that is rendered, unfortunately, is this negative polarization where there's online arguments and everybody retreats to their own corners, and there's been a lack of a positive political dialogue. So John Kerry, what he said was, really moronic, but there's something to be said for that. Look, not everybody gets to yell at everybody else, and we can't have a society that's that contentious, right? But the idea that we should limit speech, the government should impose laws that limit speech, is highly disfavored. We just had the VP. We're recording this on October 3rd, ladies and gentlemen, and we just had the VP debate the other night, and it was an amazing exchange that, as a lawyer, you did a face palm about. But there was an exchange between Waltz and JD Vance where they were talking about free speech, and Waltz goes, "You can't yell." They were talking about online. The Biden administration has made concerted efforts to limit online speech.
Right.
Specifically, there's the if you're following this, there's the Twitter leaks about specific governmental involvement in Twitter to try to get them to censor certain types of speech, and it was mostly on the conservative side of the political spectrum. So they were going back and forth about that, and what Waltz did was he applied the New York Times v. Sullivan, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, to people talking about vaccines and face masks online, right? So yeah, you have this knee-jerk reaction to try to limit speech. It's we're going to see where that goes.
Yeah, or I would say, and this goes beyond these candidates, but just kind of a general conversation about how people want to recouch speech as being violence. If you say something I don't like, or you say something discriminatory, it's now equivalent to me punching you in the face or whatever.
That's right. That's right. That's a deeply troubling, kind of perspective when it comes to free speech. Yeah. So I hope we've seen the high watermark of that. Yep. You know what, Bob? You know what I've been following recently is there's a bunch of as you know, there's trouble in the Middle East as we speak right now. Israel is invading Lebanon, and Iran is firing missiles at Israel literally today, right? So, over the spring and summer, in reaction to the initial Israeli incursion into Gaza, there was a lot of protests, pro-Hamas protests. And you had a very interesting, from a legal perspective, very interesting interactions where folks who were protesting in support of Hamas were physically intimidating, in some cases downright attacking Jewish folks, right? And the exact edge of what is protected speech versus what is assault or intimidation or harassment, all of which are to varying degrees crimes. That bleeding edge of what government's going to be allowed to do to allow political discourse while at the same time protect people from being harmed by others, that's going to be very interesting to watch. That's literally the bleeding edge of where the First Amendment sits right now, because there's some criminal prosecutions that are working their way through the court system right now, and they're obviously being defended on First Amendment grounds. Yeah,
for sure. All right, so what about sanctity of human life?
All right, so
next one. So that's obviously one we care about quite a bit.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Two things get me fired up, right? One is free exercise. The other is sanctity of life. Like, honestly, in my political engagement, I try to be pretty, chill, except for those two things. That's what gets me going, Bob. So sanctity of life. And
this has become like the targeted issue in this debate, in this election season right now.
That's right. That's right. So it's a very interesting, and I think in many ways deeply unfortunate time in our country's history as regards kind of public policy on the sanctity of life. So, look, as everyone knows, 2023, the Dobbs case comes down, and Roe versus Wade is overturned. And maybe it was 22. But
I think it was 22.
Yeah, 22, I think you're right. So it was absolutely a political catechism my entire life. I mean, I remember my dad taking me on a bus to D.C. every year, that first week of January or whatever it is. We get on the bus with all the nuns. We drive down to D.C. and we protest and for over
let the Catholic nuns.
Literally, it was Jesse and his dad in a bus full of nuns, and we have signs to overturn Roe versus Wade. I never thought I'd see the day. I really never thought I'd see it. It was the product, folks should know, of organization on the right, specifically the Federalist Society, and there was some real discipline and real focus in terms of educating conservative jurists and selecting conservative jurists. And the Trump administration, that first Trump administration, to its credit, was promised as a political tactic, promised to appoint pro-life judges, and he gosh darn it, he did it. And the Supreme Court voted, I believe it was 6-3, to overturn Roe versus Wade. So now what happens is the federal prohibition on the constitutional prohibition on anti-abortion laws goes back to the states. Right. The problem we're having, Bob, is no one really on the perspective anyway. Nobody on the pro-life side really planned for this terribly well.
Maybe nobody thought that it would actually happen.
Yeah, it's like the dog that finally caught the car. They just didn't quite know how to message this and how to communicate to the public. Look, this issue is going to, and let me take let's look at this purely pragmatically for a second. What happened in 1972 was this issue of abortion was elevated to the position of a constitutional right that takes it out of the political process. And it was deeply distortive to politics ever since. And it's been this hot button issue. It's been, it has really a cataclysmic effect in the way Americans interacted with each other.
Well, now it's being framed as a fundamental right that was taken away.
So, well, look, we had 50 years of that being a fundamental right? So women are justifiably upset that this was a right they had and it's being taken away, and that's the prism through which they look at it. And you can kind of understand it because that's the way there was 50 years of this history, right? There should have been, from my perspective, a better effort to really tell folks, look, the problem with abortion in our country was the political process, which is the way we hash out political debates in this country, right? And it never had an opportunity to happen because it was taken out of the political process and elevated to this level of constitutional protection. And now it's going to go to the states. Now best practices are going to emerge as to exactly how to deal with abortion. And I don't know if you know this. If you go to talk to someone in the EU, and someone from the EU will say, Bob, why are Americans so fired up over abortion? And you'll say to them, look, we have states where you can have abortions in the third trimester right up to the point of viability, which is 24 weeks, right? And they'll say, that's barbaric. You can have an abortion at 24 weeks in the United States of America? That is nuts.
Well, later.
Later. There's some gray here, but later, technically. In the EU, it's 12 to 14 weeks. It's basically what Florida's trying to do. And they don't understand why it's such an issue because they hashed out a long time ago. And I'm not saying the 12 to 14 weeks is biblical either. I don't love that either, honestly. But
you're making the point of saying that in Europe,
the political process dealt with the issue.
They think it's crazy that you could end the life of a baby at 24 weeks.
Yeah, and why has that happened? Because folks on the left have dug in on this issue so hard that, from my perspective, they've lost all reason. And they've tried to extend the boundaries of the right to abortion to, frankly, ridiculous and immoral extents, because they're thinking as well, look, if we lose the edge cases, we'll at least have the core right still intact, so let's push this thing as far as we can, baby, right? That's the perspective that they take, and that's why we have some of these. New Jersey is one of the worst states in the country in this regard, by the way. So that's where we sit right now. This has gone to the states. This has been, it's the 8th most important political issue in this presidential campaign, according to Pew. 60% of Democrats say it's very important, 35% of Republicans. It really is a major issue. It's been getting a lot of airtime in this presidential campaign season. And I think as Christians, we're told to be salt and light. We need to do a better job of communicating and building consensus and building some empathy around this issue. Because it's become such a political football and the pushback on there's really no intelligent pushback on it's my body, my choice, and that's a compelling mantra unless you have the vocabulary to say, we're made in God's image. Life is sacred. That's sacred aspect of human life extends to the womb. And heartbeats and brain waves and the fact that fetal viability is being achieved earlier and earlier, and having a positive, productive discourse about this just doesn't seem to be happening. So as regards to politics,
well, and certainly even in that, even on the Republican side, there's been a weird moderation on this.
That's right.
Because I guess there's a thought that somehow that's going to pull in.
That's right.
More independent voters.
So Trump has gotten quite wishy-washy on this.
I think it should have been much more. We're gonna expose this for what it is, and they haven't done that.
No. From my perspective, there has not been intelligent messaging on this from the right, including in the Trump campaign. Right, instead of saying, "Look, this is what we believe is right. This is what we believe is the appropriate balance between the right of a woman to have control over her own body and the rights of the unborn. This is what we think is good public policy, and here's why." Instead of that sort of dialogue, it's been just kind of wishy-washy. I'm for heartbeat bills. I'm against heartbeat bills. I don't know. And my administration is going to be great for women's reproductive rights. He just makes these kind of broad pronouncements like that. It's not very comforting if you're a voter from a Christian perspective who has that first on your mind, right?
Yeah.
And on the Harris side, I mean, it's been as close to a pro-abortion maximalist position as you're ever going to see a politician take. She refused to impose any restrictions on abortion right up to the point of fetal viability, right? So her official position is right up to viability, have at it, right? And it's probably the most progressive perspective we've ever seen a political nominee make.
Yeah. All right, well, why don't we finish off with, do you mind if we combine the last two? So we're talking about marriage and family and parental rights. What are some hot-button things there, and what's going on in that album?
Sure. So just in terms of hot-button issues, so I don't know if folks saw this, but in August, a New Jersey court struck down policies propounded by 3 different school boards. These school boards were from conservative districts. They tried to impose rules that required school officials to inform parents when a child had there was a change in gender identity. There was an affirmative obligation to notify the parents in these 3 school districts.
Yep.
And that was struck down by New Jersey courts as unlawful discrimination, right? So it really is cutting-edge cases being made. It was national news right here in New Jersey, made by our unelected judges. And folks should be aware of that's where our specific state is right now on this issue, where the parental rights are subordinated to gender identity worldview.
Yeah. And you know what? I would say I was just listening to an influential, I would say, depending on what stream you go on, this guy was a pretty influential pastor, podcaster, all that. And he was sort of treating this issue as a bit of a boogeyman, like, oh, we shouldn't be so concerned about this, like you were just creating fear. And I got to tell you, I anecdotally, I've heard a lot of things happening, and I just wonder that there's a lot more of this that's going on throughout the country that's not being reported about, and it's a very real issue for a lot of people.
Yeah, this is being litigated in California right now. The Supreme Court just declined to take a case out of Maryland on similar grounds. This is really bubbling up across the country. And to your point, Bob, so the issue with this, right?
So my point is, it's not a boogeyman.
No,
it's real.
No. So it's about trends. It's about right. What is the next? Where does this issue go from here, right? If parental rights can be subordinated to gender identity, where you as a parent have no right to know how your child is being treated at school with respect to gender issues, right? So this is happening completely apart from your knowledge as a parent. You have no ability to be informed of the issue or to speak into the issue. And of course, in California, there's been cases where parents have been prosecuted or when parents have lost custody in divorce scenarios where one parent refused to engage in gender-affirming care for a transitioning kid. So look, you can have a lot of perspectives on gender identity. What I can't, and I can give you daylight, right? What I can't handle is cases where kids are being manipulated into, at very young ages, 5, 7, 9 years old, are being given this irreversible, gender quote unquote, people can't see my air quotes at home, gender affirming care.
I can see your air quotes right
where
there.
there's irreversible changes made to a child's body that is going to have massive health repercussions down the road. And in fact, I don't know if you know this, but in the UK, there was a very, 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 very interesting. There was an explosion just during COVID and right after of these types of surgeries, the demand for these surgeries. And the government over the health system over there is centralized. It's government health system, right? Yeah. And this was all being tracked, and they're going, oh my gosh, we're like 10x the surgeries we used to do. What is happening to people in terms of the demand for this? And there were studies done, and there was information.
Well, the UK started to limit it.
Yes, and now the UK has completely. What is happening is because they're a couple years ahead of us on these trends, and what's happening is a lot of these kids have now come out of that phase of their development where they're saying, "What the heck did you do to me? I was 9." And you cut my body and made these irreversible changes, and now I'm marred for life. You got to be kidding me. And there's a lot of liability that doctors, they're getting sued, right?
Right.
So all this to say, never underestimate the lawyers. The lawyers will always find a way to make a buck. If you learn nothing else from this podcast, definitely learn that. So my point is this. That this is about trends.
That's where we're going to end right there.
Yeah, that's right. In mic drop. that this is about trends. So is this a boogeyman issue? Are people of faith getting too wound up about gender identity? I would say yes and no. I would say we need to show grace to folks who are caught up in this. I think there's a combination of real clinical issues that are legitimate and social contagion that's going on that's getting people caught up in it. I think the proliferation of sexual imagery in our society is causing some of this, and the science is still emerging about what this looks like, right?
Yeah.
So folks are being caught up in this. Folks are suffering from it. These people are not happy. They're folks who have gender identity issues are typically combined with all sorts of mental health concerns. That's not me talking. Google it. And we as Christians need to show Christ's love. Yeah. On the other hand, parental rights. Right, and our ability to believe what we believe, to have a biblical perspective on what gender is and how God created us as human beings, we can't surrender that high ground. And I don't think it is a boogeyman. I don't think it is a red herring. I think it's something we need to ground we need to stand on and we need to defend. I also think that God is testing us. He's testing our faith. Right. He told us in His Word what we're to believe about who we are, made in God's image, man and woman. What biblical healthy perspective is on sex and identity, and are we going to be swayed from that by the mores of our times, right? I think that that's a test of our faith, and I think we have a duty to stand up for that. So look, in this political season, I actually think there's not a whole lot in terms of what the campaigns are saying. There's not a whole lot of gender identity in this campaign season. It's almost like they've swept it under the rug.
Well, I will say one thing that's very telling is we've had 3 presidential debates and
never came up. It's so funny how that works, isn't it? They realize it doesn't poll too well.
Climate change, 0 questions about this.
It turns out that mutilating kids because of your progressive worldview doesn't poll too well in those swing states, Bob. So that's why you don't hear about it.
So, anyway. All right, well, maybe as we wrap up, is there a couple application points you'd leave us with that we what should we be doing as a result of this from the legal side?
I think number one, stay informed. Stay in the Word, pay attention to the news, stay informed. Like if we as persons of faith don't track what's happening with religious liberty, with free exercise of religion, and these biblical issues in our political discourse, if we don't keep track of it, no one's going to, right? I think that's number one. I think number two, we need to have an attitude of Christ-like grace in terms of how we interact with people we disagree with. I think we need to have a sense of humility and just a sense of Christ-like grace in terms of interacting on these points, because no one ever argued anybody into heaven, right? Yeah. And I just think that 3 is just stay in prayer and stay in the Word, because if we view life through a biblical perspective, we're always going to stay true. And these changes in the Supreme Court case law, these positions that politicians take, are mere temporal details. If we have a eternal perspective as biblical, right? These are blips, right? We have an eternal perspective. We have an unchanging God. We have a value system that is is not susceptible to these vacillations, right? So we should always hold on to that, always lock in, stay in the Word, stay focused on that, and you're going to start to see a perspective emerge.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, Jesse, this has been great discussion. Thanks so much. I always love having you on here.
Always a lot of fun.
And it's cool to have you here in person in the studio. So we'll have to do it again. Thanks so much for joining us today on the Underground Sessions podcast. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, like this video, and we will see you next time for an exciting episode.